Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Reinsurance Podcast. I'm your co-host, Jared Lee.
And I'm Ben Rose.
Good to see you, sir.
And you too. And what, Jared, are we here to talk about today?
Today, we have another installment of how do we make this sound interesting?
Yeah, I should give context. I'm sat here with my background laugh prepared for when Jared tries to make today's topic sound exciting, because it is exciting, but it just doesn't sound exciting.
Yeah, so what we wanted to try to unpack today in our effort to make it sound exciting is reinsurance accounting.
But it is cool. And it is cool, and I can tell you why it's cool. It's because people like Jared and myself in a past life were in the strategy consulting world, specifically for reinsurance, where our main source of data was the thing or the things that reinsurance companies revealed about themselves in their accounts.
Yeah.
And yeah, they can look like a bunch of meaningless numbers to the uninitiated, but actually there's some fascinating stories buried in those accounts that only come out with the right kind of understanding that we're here to share with you all today. Yeah,
and we'll touch on other things like how when you look at contracts, how that premium gets sort of flowed up, and then from there, once reinsurance is on the books, what that might look like for a cedent. So without further ado, I don't use a do, by the way, on Wordle. Do you cheat when you do your Wordles with you starting with a do?
I don't play Wordle.
Oh man, get involved.
Although I did find out there's a background story that needs to come out here as well. I discovered there's quite a few Wordle spin-offs.
Yeah.
So there's a maths one, there's a few others, but the one that I got sent the other day was called Chessel.
Okay.
And it's basically a chess puzzle kind of thing. And the reason I got sent that was because I've recently started playing chess, and Jared and myself do in the background of running Superseed as a way of making sure that it's a constant connection between us, have a constant series of chess games running between the two of us.
I always know you're okay by the last chess move. It's like, okay.
Yeah, just through all of the horrible debates and fights, that constantly plague us. There's that background chess game to keep us sane.
But tangent aside, without further ado, the sort of process of reinsurance accounting. The thing that I think is really interesting with how this starts out is it underlies one of the more interesting nuances of what reinsurance is, which is when an insurance company buys their own insurance, which we've talked about in earlier episodes. But one of the things that makes it really fascinating is, unlike traditional insurance where a car or a home has this sort of value up front, what the insurance company is doing is buying their insurance in advance, especially with a treaty. But they're saying, next year, I expect to write this many homes, and I expect to make this much income, and therefore incur this much risk as a business. And I want you, reinsurance company, to sort of support us on that. But you don't know how much they're actually going to write. So one of the first things that they introduced was, how do we begin to do this? And to use a sort of an analogy with the consumer space, it's kind of like buying pay-as-you-go car insurance, but like for next year, I'm going to drive 12,000 miles. Last year I drove 8, but the year before I drove 6. So I feel like 12 is what's going to happen this year. I moved farther from work, and that's why. So you're trying to pre-buy this.
It makes me think of like a phone plan or something, where you're like, you don't know how many texts you're going to send next year or next month or whatever, but it's probably going to be, you want at least 12,000. I'm kidding. I don't have that many friends. You want at least 5. There's 5 monthly messages that you're going to send, and you want so much data and so on, and you need a framework that's going to allow for that. But equally, you need a way for the phone company to get paid if you don't use it, because otherwise the phone company is like putting itself out there, giving you all this coverage. Yeah, but you might not actually use it.
Yeah, and you begin to see this sort of natural evolution for how the product evolves. So when they realize that an insurance company sells way more policies than they were expecting to, or way less policies, if in that existing model, a reinsurer could be sort of really hung out. As you said, you buy for 5 texts and you send hundreds of thousands because it becomes your marketing channel or something similar. Like, what is the best way? Or if you buy the biggest package you could, but you only send like 5 messages, it feels like a massive underutilization. One of the things the industry introduced was this concept of M&D, so minimum and deposit premiums. But essentially setting a baseline for how much the insurance company would pay. If they write way less than what they're hoping to write, they have like sort of the minimum that they'll pay each month, or in this case, a year. But then also, if sort of allowing for unlimited upside, if they write way more, building a mechanism into place that allows them to proportionately compensate the reinsurer for the additional risk that they took on. So this was one of the things that when I first got into placing risk that I found really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those. I mean, this is a gateway drug in terms of examples of where this can go, but it's one of those concepts that shows how reinsurance just gets bespokely crafted.
Yeah.
Pretty much each time in terms of the rules that can be set to govern how all these different things work. So because nothing is known in advance and you have to take account of all sorts of different scenarios emerging, people then say, oh, okay, well, how much ceding commission should we get on this portfolio as well, right? And maybe the broker, or maybe or maybe the cedant that's actually effectively fronting the business for the reinsurer and doing all the hard work to get the business in the door. Maybe the amount of commission they should get should also depend on how much business they put through, or even how profitable that business is once they put it through. And so all these little rules and triggers end up getting written into the contract, which determine the ultimate price that's going to be set for it.
Yeah. Well, and we talked about this in an earlier episode, but you can really, if you look hard, you can see this natural evolution, right? Where at first it's just, this is how we'll buy reinsurance on it. And then the person who's preparing and bringing all that risk to the market goes, well, hang on a second. I do all this hard work and I'm getting none of the rewards. So I want, I want a bit of a kickback on this. And they go, okay, we can introduce a ceding commission. We'll give you, and then you can see the next step, which would be something like, but that wasn't none of that business was profitable. And someone going, okay, but what if we write really good business for you? You'll give us a better ceding commission. If it's not as good a business, we'll get a less of it. But you can sort of see the natural evolution of people collectively solving problems around how they want to be compensated and rewarded and things from this process.
Yeah, and just I guess to continue then this sort of M&D style approach, we don't know how much we're actually going to write. There's an ultimate state that this gets us to, of writing this kind of business, which I'm going to introduce one concept at this stage, which is a difference between sort of written and earned premium as well. So a lot of times, many things around pricing will be based on the premium that is going to be taken on. And when you're trying to measure premium, you may see some terms floating around like written premium and earned premium. And Jared, at a high level, do you want to just give us a guide on what those things mean?
Yeah, and it's this term should be relatively easy to digest for people who've spent some time in like accounting. But you buy a car insurance policy for a year, that policy, say, is £1,200 each. So the written premium is $1,200, but each month you sort of earn 100 of that, right? So when you look at an insurance company who's writing policies every single day throughout the year, they're kind of trying to adjust, well, how much have we written? How much do we expect to come through? How much have we earned to date? But how much have we sort of written in the aggregate? So that's kind of at the very high level how I would, but add to that if you think I've missed.
No, it's brilliant. And I was thinking, I mean, just I was imagining a sort of funny chordy sound effect to go like, boring alert for what we were talking about. So to make this slightly more interesting for those people whose eyes have glazed over at this point in the conversation, can you think of any weird examples where we're having to guess in advance for different lines of business what premium we're going to write? Because one of the ones that I always think about here is aviation, which is really interesting in terms of how it's measured, because you're insuring effectively based on the number of planes and the number of flights that those planes take and the capacity of the people who are likely to board those planes. With the rules written in different ways, I'm not an aviation underwriter or broker, but there's many ways in which you can sort of calculate how much risk overall is going to be taken on by this airline, or by an insurer that's insuring several airlines. Because if that airline is sending planes full of Americans, side story, Americans are the most expensive passengers. If you accidentally, there's a chart somewhere, I think, where you can see. But if you accidentally crash a plane filled with American passengers, then it's a lot more expensive than non-American passengers.
Is litigation sort of driving that?
Yeah, just the amount that you have to pay out in claims and things typically is a lot higher. So that's why I think one of the Lloyd's realistic disaster scenarios is like 2 planes colliding in midair over New York or
LA to New York crashing into each other in both directions.
Yeah, but basically, how many of these flights? How many people per flight? How many different planes? What are they flying over? Trying to guess in advance what the exposure is going to be and to relate that to the amount of flights is really difficult and really important. So hopefully that adds a bit of color to this idea of like what are we trying to guess at this year? I don't have any other examples front of mind for you.
I think those are really good ones. Marine and freight is similar. It's dependent upon, let's assume that none of the global regulatory processes and tax jurisdictions and things shift or change this year, and all the sort of cargo we're planning to ship from this port to that port is going to go ahead as planned, or and starting with that assumption, but knowing that at any point you could introduce sanctions against certain countries or similar that results in either far less cargo going on those ships not going at all. The pandemic really shut down sort of airline travel in its entirety. So, what was going to be hundreds of thousands of flights a day, I think, is that a good number?
I don't know. That seems big to me, but maybe it's spot on because there's a lot. How many planes are there? And all of those planes do 4 flights a day. Well, that's long haul. All those planes do several flights a day.
Yeah.
The number of total planes in the world that are active times by 5. I don't know.
I did a consulting case study ages ago about how many planes come out of Heathrow in a day, and it was like the number of.
That's probably an insane number, isn't it?
It's
every 2 minutes or something, right?
Yeah,
maybe hundreds of thousands then, because there's lots of Heathrows.
But
the
math during the pandemic was much easier. 5. 5 that are empty with the pilots only. So you're trying to estimate up front. These are all the things that are true at the point of us writing this business. But throughout the year, all manner of things could radically change that. And it could be everything from a volcano, which we've seen as well, that shuts down air travel in huge swaths of Europe, to pandemics, to sanctions. So it becomes very nuanced but it adds this level of interesting work that the underwriters have to take into account. And you mentioned the RDS, so realistic disaster scenarios, which is a thing that Lloyd's sort of exclusively does. Is it something that other markets do? Is this a unique to Lloyd's sort of process?
So I think with that term, it's a Lloyd's required thing, but it's part of helping the syndicates to calculate their solvency in the event of sort of 1 in 200 events.
Yeah.
So I think in order to meet Solvency II style requirements, lots of people are doing similar things.
Yeah.
But the reason Lloyd's do it specifically around a coordinated scenario across all the syndicates is in case all of the syndicates get impacted by, or several of the syndicates get impacted by the same event at once.
Yeah. Well, and it also makes sense. It makes sense in Lloyd's sort of framework to sort of judge them all in the same test, rather than just everyone kind of running out their own numbers. But now that the insurance company has made an attempt at estimating how much risk they're going to take on, they have an internal calculation as to how much risk they want to keep and how much they want to offload to the reinsurance parties. They go through and they purchase their reinsurance. And then you introduce sort of like the process by which are they buying it on a gross written basis or a net written basis or net earned basis. And this is where you start getting all manner of acronyms and things coming through.
Yeah, and I guess let's just touch on gross and net, because that's an interesting one. Again, we've got lots of people on the podcast who might not be as familiar with these terms. I'd say at a high level, beware gross and net can be confusing, because what you're effectively saying is like gross is the number untouched, and net is once you've removed something. Mm-hmm. But depending on what you remove and which order you put these terms in, it might mean that you're removing slightly different things. So some people account gross net and some people account net gross, depending on, or net or gross, depending on which elements they're talking about. But some of the classic things that we're looking at here are reinsurance, for example, expenses, things that can be taken out of your overall premium or calculation, whatever it might be, because those terms gross and net can be used for the high level numbers like premium, but then also for calculations based on premium. So if you're looking at a loss ratio, you can have a gross loss ratio, you can have a net loss ratio, and so on. So at a high level, that's what those terms are getting at, how much has been included or excluded from that calculation.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned earlier the work that we'd sort of done in our consulting days on this. And everyone reports this ever so slightly differently. So you always, when you try to look at industry trends as a whole or at a higher level, it adds a level of nuance and a level of uncertainty to that process going, well, we're going to present this on a sort of the net basis, or we think this is the net loss ratio that we think we can sort of showcase or evidence to. But we don't have 100% certainty always into what are all the elements that have come out. There's no ability to do this really at scale. Any individual carrier might know theirs, but it's when you look at it across a number of different large carriers, it's very difficult to get a real standard.
Yeah, and I think it's probably worth us introducing some really interesting concepts here. And I say that with my heart. They really are interesting. You just give them a chance. Bear with us, and we'll take you through these terms.
Come on a journey with us.
Come on the journey with us. But what we're going to do is now take you through a combined ratio.
Okay.
Combined ratio. Yeah. Let that roll around on your palate.
Yeah.
Combined because it's sticking together several things. Mm-hmm. And in total, the target number for this that we all need to watch out for is 100%. So combined ratio is looking at an underwriting level, have you made money or lost money doing your underwriting? So when you add up everything, so your loss ratio, so how much you lost, which includes losses and loss adjustment expenses, and then you add up your expenses, which includes your administrative costs for running your business and keeping the lights on, and your acquisition costs for actually paying commissions and getting access to the business. When you add up all of that, if it's less than 100%, you're in the money-making zone, which is great, because what we're effectively saying is that all of your costs, in proportion to all of your income, the income was bigger. But if it goes over 100%, so you see firms reporting a 102% combined ratio, for example, that means that their losses plus expenses basically have exceeded the amount of premiums that they were able to bring into the business.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting is that's not the entire picture as well. So we'll dive into some of those components in a bit more detail in a moment. But that combined ratio is not the final answer because of something called investment income as well. I don't know how familiar our listeners will be with this, but actually in the early days of underwriting, etc., because investment returns were so high, there was a lot less attention actually on underwriting results, so that 100% combined ratio. So you could go out there, and as long as you got the business in, and as long as it wasn't really, really terrible, you could be writing 106% combined ratios. So technically writing business at a loss. But if you're getting a big enough investment return on all of that float model of capital that you're being paid, that means actually that quite quickly you've got enough funds through the investment income to repay any losses on the underwriting side and make a profit overall.
Yeah, and Berkshire is a famous example of this, where a firm that had enough capital flowing into their other investment pools that they could return more than that. The other thing that I think is really interesting here is when you look at how the industry thinks about its challenges, there's always going to be a loss ratio, right? And it's always going to be sort of a target percentage based on the class of business, et cetera. But the industry gets a lot of heat about the expense ratio, like how much money goes into just running these businesses, the cost associated with it. Because yes, you might have a really good year where your losses are lower than others, but in really standard, well understood classes, aviation, marine, motor, like they kind of know where the loss ratio is going to sit on any given year. There's enough data for that. So they're looking at it going, how do we sort of ruthlessly cut out sometimes 30, 40, 50% of just expenses associated with every dollar of premium that they get in? And there's a lot of the big innovation efforts have been set at how do we bring that ratio down so that we can perform more on just the claims that we have to pay out, and advising that model a bit better.
Totally, and I think it's really interesting to actually see how these costs change over time according to any strategy consultants also out there listening. Things like the product life cycle. Mm-hmm. So you start with a relatively new product. Typically, what happens is your expenses are very high because you've never written that product line before. Maybe it's quite hard to get access to the business. That's why a lot of new MGA style models have very high expenses when they first get set up. Mm-hmm. And also the loss ratios tend to be pretty unpredictable. Sometimes you get lucky and you get an amazing loss ratio. Sometimes you're getting a really heavy loss ratio. If it's new for you and not necessarily new for everyone else, then typically you're having to undercut the existing market to be able to grab share. So for newer products, typically you'll see those expense ratios and loss ratios look quite different compared to very commoditized products. So products that have been around for a very long time, increasingly it is, as you were saying, all about how do we cut costs, because the price is the price, is the market price. There's not much innovation around what you're actually selling here. It's quite standardized. So whoever can remove expenses in order to be able to offer the best price is typically going to benefit the most in those kind of scenarios. We do have quite a visible product life cycle, I would say, in insurance and reinsurance as well.
Yeah, and you touched on something else that I think is worth looking into a bit more, but the sort of performance of underwriters. A lot of times, you have a CUO or you have individual sort of lead underwriters or head underwriters for a specific class of business or product. And a lot of times their performance is getting measured on how profitable is that book of business. But as you sort of touched on, that can be quite variable. And if they get a bad cat year, the loss ratio or the combined ratio is huge, but they could also avoid a cat and have a really profitable book of business for 10 years in a row based more on luck. So have you seen sort of the remuneration model in our industry sort of aligning with the combined ratio of those underwriters?
I think, one of the things I wanted to introduce to that actually as an extra layer is short tail versus long tail as well. Yeah. Because to your point, we have things like catastrophe underwriters who are judged on the performance, over a very long schedule, but kind of based on luck. It's quite hard to prove that you were a brilliant underwriter or a terrible underwriter based on whether a hurricane happened or not, because chances are you're going to get exposed to it in some way. I am always impressed by those underwriters that are able to, I guess, loss pick and choose very specifically which accounts and which layers within those accounts. So when I say accounts, I mean clients effectively. So, you're going to take the first, a big chunk of the first layer and not too much of the upper layers of this regional US client. I'm going to take only the upper layers, or as much as I can of the upper layers, but avoid the attritional layers of this nationwide account. Whatever your strategy might be, but seeing how, when, not if, but when the market gets hit by a big event, how did your portfolio on the reinsurance side perform versus other underwriters writing a similar portfolio? I think that's where the underwriters start to differentiate themselves. But on the long tail side, you're waiting a really, really long time to find out whether or not your underwriting has been effective or not. I don't know if you can explain that.
Well, I wanted to touch on, so for the people who aren't as familiar with the industry, the difference between short and long tail. So a very common short tail class would be property. Like at the end of the year, did this home burn down or not? Very yes or no. But in casualty, one of the long tail classes, it extends out a much longer time. So, was workplace conditions unhealthy so that 4 or 5 years later, someone has an asthmatic issue or asbestosis or something that was quite common, a big claim that the industry had, where 7-8 years later you're saying, well, the time I spent working here exposed me to this issue, and therefore I'm making a claim, which insurance will pay for, but we're talking several years from the point by which you were exposed to something. But you're right, in that scenario, it's much more difficult for an underwriter to say, this year, I didn't write anything that was exposed to asbestos, therefore I'm a great underwriter, when we don't know that asbestosis is a thing for 10 more years, right? So it's harder to sort of present the case that you're a really good underwriter, where in the property example, you say, I chose to write in these geographies at these different layers and levels, one sort of cat event happened and we avoided it because of my genius underwriting, and this other one didn't happen and therefore also we're geniuses, and the profitability is really, really high. But you can have an assessment of that at the end of every year, or at the end of whenever you draw the line in the sand for that year being done. And casualty or long tail business more generally doesn't have such a clear line of sight for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So hopefully now, having listened to all that, and I understand if you need to go back to the beginning and listen to some of that again, you now will look at a news press release about such and such an underwriter releases its annual results with a bit more nous and skepticism. Yeah. When you see those numbers coming in, or people trying to spin a combined ratio as a brilliant result, etc., you'll be able to look at that and really interrogate it. Yeah. But and
get a bit of insight into, if you're seeing combined ratios for several years in a row over 100, a bit of reason why that company isn't out of business, perhaps, right? There's more happening there.
Absolutely. But to relax things after that, because that was
it's a heavy one.
It's one of the most intense technical episodes I think we've done so far. I have a related Frisk Risk for you, Jared, to end on.
It's our favorite segment.
It is. So this one, I'm going to be up front with you. It is a real risk.
Okay.
There was a building that burned down. That is the risk that's happened. Mm-hmm. But the frisking comes into what did they do about the reinsurance? Because basically in this scenario, very famous legal case, I say very famous, apparently it's in one of the top 50 reinsurance case law examples of all time.
That's as famous as we get sometimes.
Exactly, which I expect everyone universally to be very deeply familiar with. But basically in this particular case, there was a $7 million limit available for the insurer to claim with its reinsurers. And in the process of the insurer working out whether they were going to pay the claim in the first place with the client, there was heavy litigation because there was suspected arson that led to this $43 million building burning down. And the cost of that litigation spiraled and became really, really expensive. And they had this huge debate about whether loss adjusting expenses, which in this case amounted to $5 million, were included in the reinsurer's limit, or whether they were additional to that as well. So the insurance company basically sent the reinsurer a bill once this was settled, and it was settled that the insurer had to pay the claim. And they said, well, it's $12 million, please, because the limit's for the $7 million. Yep. Plus we've got $5 million of loss adjusting expenses. And this bounced back and forwards between the courts. So the lower courts, first one said, yeah, absolutely. The second one said, no, hang on, that shouldn't be included. How did it end up is my Frisk Risk challenge. What did they ultimately decide?
Oh, these are getting much more tricky, which is good. This is super interesting because when you look at how reinsurance contracts are written, a lot of these things are not as clearly defined in a way that makes like it very black and white. Because you'd think that, well, whatever the contract said, it would say this is or is not included. But so oftentimes, like the nuance of this industry is the spectrum of gray areas that we work in. I'm going to hedge my guess on Frisk Risk and say they settled parts of LAE. So they didn't get the 12, but they got more than the 7, is my guess. They agreed to meet in the middle and give them $2.5 million of loss adjusted expense cover instead of.
It's a good guess. Unfortunately, it's not the correct one. But I liked your way of thinking about it and avoiding being completely wrong.
Yeah,
but you're partly wrong.
What? How did it work?
So what actually ended up happening?
What's the building, by the way?
I can't remember.
Okay.
It was some big building that caught fire. Not a particularly significant one.
Fine.
But yeah, basically, in the end, they had to decide that it was $5 million in this case of, much bigger than expected loss adjustment expenses. But if they set the precedent that loss adjusting expenses would be included in the limit at that point, that would not be included in the limit and could just be added on top, then that would imply that the parties had intended on creating the contract that the reinsurer would be liable for potentially unlimited cover for loss adjustment expenses. And they decided that surely the parties could not have intended or premeditated that the reinsurer would pay above the limit any loss adjustment expenses, no matter how large.
Yeah.
So they successfully won the case on that basis and limited their reinsurance payout to just the $7 million for the actual claim.
Yeah.
And no further costs beyond that.
So
the limit had to include the loss adjusted expenses as well, at least in that case. So.
Which leaves the insurer with essentially $2 million in overall return because they spent their $5 on on lawyers, which I think makes sense as well, though, because you'd look at it running up all manner of extortionately expensive law firms and huge teams and as you said, to an unlimited amount, which isn't the intention of the contract. That was a good one.
Yeah, I'll keep
stay tuned for the next Frisk Risk. We're getting serious on these ones. We'll have to work our way up the reinsurance litigation handbook of the 50 most important cases.
And what you don't realize, folks, is what we're really doing here is training you for future episodes where this gets more and more complex. You can do accounting now. You can do reinsurance law now. Just wait for what happens on our next episode.
Yeah. With that, we shall bid you adieu. Thanks, everyone.